Did Johnny Carson ever insult a guest on live television? For 3 decades, Carson built his reputation on restraint. He absorbed chaos, deflected embarrassment, and protected guests even when they were clearly unraveling. His genius wasn't confrontation. It was control. Which is why the moments when that control broke are so revealing. There were rare occasions when a guest pushed too far, threatened the structure of the show itself, and forced Carson to respond. Not with anger, not with jokes, but with unmistakable correction. These are the only 7 times Johnny Carson chose to do exactly that. Madonna, 1987. When Madonna appeared on The Tonight Show in 1987, she was already famous, but she was not yet untouchable. She was in the middle of redefining pop stardom, deliberately challenging religious imagery, with sexual norms, and the boundaries of mainstream media. What she did not usually challenge was format. And Johnny Carson's show was nothing if not format. Carson's late-night world functioned on an unspoken agreement. Guests could tease, flirt, even shock slightly, but the host controlled the temperature. Carson guided the exchange, protected the audience from discomfort, and protected guests from themselves. Madonna arrived, having no interest in that balance. From the moment she walked on stage, the shift was palpable. Her outfit alone broke with Tonight Show tradition, less promotional attire than provocation. But it was her manner that unsettled the room. She didn't respond to Carson's questions so much as redirect them. She spoke over him. She escalated his innuendo into explicit territory. She treated the interview not as conversation, but as confrontation. At first, Carson did what he always did. He smiled. He laughed lightly. He attempted to redirect with subtle phrasing and gentle pauses. But Madonna pushed again, and again. Each time, the tone slipped further from Carson's control. This was no longer playful discomfort. It was deliberate defiance. Then something changed. Carson's laughter stopped cushioning the moment. His responses became shorter. His face tightened, not with anger, but with calculation. When Madonna crossed another line, Carson corrected her openly, not sharply, not loudly, but unmistakably. The correction landed in silence. For viewers accustomed to Carson's unflappable ease, the moment was jarring. He wasn't joking anymore. He wasn't playing along. He was reclaiming the structure of the show in real time. The insult was not a punchline. It was withdrawal. Carson stopped giving Madonna space. He limited her momentum. He reasserted control not by humiliating her, but by refusing to indulge her performance. In Carson's world, that was the clearest signal of disapproval. Behind the scenes, producers later acknowledged that Carson felt deliberately undermined. Madonna hadn't misread the room. She had chosen to ignore it. Carson, who prided himself on protecting guests even when they embarrassed themselves, felt she had used the show as a stage rather than a collaboration. The audience response split instantly. Younger viewers thrilled at the rebellion. Older viewers recoiled at the breach of decorum. What neither side missed was Carson's shift. The power dynamic had changed, and everyone felt it. Madonna's appearance became legendary, not because Carson lost control, but because he chose, briefly, not to protect her from the consequences of her approach. Despite multiple albums, tours, and films in the years that followed, Madonna was never invited back. In a career defined by patience and restraint, this was one of the rare moments Johnny Carson chose correction over charm. And in doing so, he delivered one of the quietest and clearest insults of his entire tenure. Oliver Reed, 1975. By the time Oliver Reed appeared on The Tonight Show in 1975, his reputation preceded him. In Britain, he was celebrated for his raw intensity and unpredictable charisma. In Hollywood, he was viewed with caution. Stories of heavy drinking and volatile behavior followed him from set to set. Still, Carson booked him, Because Carson believed even difficult guests deserved a chance to be handled professionally. Almost immediately, it was clear that this appearance would test that belief. Reed's walk to the chair was unsteady. His speech slurred before the interview had even begun. Crew members later recalled the smell of alcohol, reaching several feet beyond the couch. This was not a guest who had indulged casually. This was a man already far past control. Carson recognized the danger instantly. His approach shifted to containment. He slowed his delivery. He asked straightforward questions. He attempted to anchor Reed in the purpose of the appearance, promoting a film, answering politely, moving on. But Reed resisted structure at every turn. He interrupted Carson repeatedly. He challenged him without provocation, and he drifted into hostility with no warning. What made the exchange especially uncomfortable was Reed's instability. He swung erratically between charm and aggression, between rambling stories and confrontational remarks. Carson tried to redirect him gently, then more firmly. Each attempt failed. This was the moment Carson almost never allowed viewers to see: calculation under pressure. As Reed became increasingly incoherent, Carson stopped cushioning the exchange. His tone flattened. His patience shortened. When Reed crossed yet another line, Carson addressed the situation directly. He corrected Reed's behavior on air and abruptly ended the segment. For a host whose pride rested on never embarrassing a guest, this was extraordinary. The insult wasn't theatrical. It was decisive. Cutting a segment short was Carson's ultimate expression of disapproval. It signaled that the guest had exhausted the host's willingness to protect them from public collapse. The audience felt the finality immediately. Laughter gave way to stunned quiet. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly told producers simply, "Let's not do that again." For Reed, the consequences were severe. Hollywood executives who had been on the fence now had recorded proof of the risk he posed. Casting offers dried up. His American career never recovered. What makes this moment so significant isn't Reed's behavior. Many guests had struggled on Carson's couch. It's Carson's response. He didn't joke his way out. He didn't allow the chaos to continue. He chose to end it. In doing so, Carson delivered one of the clearest on-air rebukes of his career. Not through insult comedy, not through humiliation, but through removal. In Carson's world, there was no stronger signal than that. Don Rickles, 1976. Don Rickles was not just another guest on The Tonight Show. He was part of the furniture. For years, Rickles and Johnny Carson shared one of late-night television's most trusted dynamics. Rickles insulted. Carson laughed harder than anyone. The audience understood the rhythm. Rickles was allowed to cross lines because those lines were, paradoxically, controlled. Nothing was personal. Nothing was disruptive. Until one night, it was. The incident began off-camera, the night before the moment viewers remember. During a commercial break, Rickles sat in Carson's chair, a common enough joke among frequent guests. What was not common was what followed. Rickles accidentally broke Carson's cigarette box, a personal item that had sat on the host's desk for years. It was a small object, but in Carson's world, symbols mattered. The next night, Rickles wasn't scheduled to appear. Carson mentioned the broken box on air, lightly, almost playfully. It was meant as a tease, a footnote. Then Rickles stormed the set uninvited, still dressed in full costume from his sitcom, CPO Sharky. At first, the audience loved it. A surprise entrance. Rickles in character. Carson laughing along. It felt spontaneous in the way live television rarely allowed. But then, Rickles didn't leave. He grabbed the desk. He dominated the stage. He drowned out the host. What had started as a joke turned into a takeover. This was the moment Carson's expression changed. He continued smiling, but the ease was gone, and the rhythm had collapsed. Rickles wasn't playing within the structure anymore. He was dismantling it. Carson allowed it to continue just long enough for the audience to feel the shift. Then came the correction. Carson held up the cigarette box, calmly, clearly. He explained what Rickles had done and why it mattered. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He let the object speak. In doing so, Carson reframed the moment. This was no longer a comic intrusion. It was a breach of respect. The laughter softened. Rickles sensed it. The moment ended. The insult wasn't a punchline. It was exposure. Carson had reminded Rickles and the audience that even friendship had limits. The desk was not a toy. The show was not a free-for-all. And Carson, despite his relaxed persona, was still in charge. Behind the scenes, your staff later confirmed that Carson was genuinely angry. Not because Rickles had broken a box, but because he had broken the structure. Carson valued spontaneity only when it served the show. Rickles had made himself the point. Though the two men remained friends, insiders noted a cooling period afterward. Rickles returned, but the edge softened. The boundaries were clearer. What makes this incident so revealing is not the chaos itself, but Carson's response. He didn't ban Rickles. He didn't humiliate him. He simply reminded him, on air, where the authority resided. In a career built on tolerance, this was one of the rare moments Johnny Carson chose correction over comfort. And for those who understood the language of late-night television, the message could not have been clearer. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was never a predictable guest. By the time she appeared on The Tonight Show during Johnny Carson's tenure, she was already known for her intensity, her bluntness, and her tendency to dominate any room she entered. Carson understood this. He booked her anyway. Unpredictability, when managed, could still be entertaining. This time, it wasn't. What began as a routine panel discussion slowly unraveled. Winters grew agitated over a comment made by another guest seated beside her. Accounts differ on who it was, but the trigger mattered less than the response. Winters didn't deflect the remark or turn it into humor. She escalated. Her voice rose. She interrupted repeatedly. She stopped engaging Carson entirely. As the exchange intensified, the show's rhythm collapsed. Carson attempted his usual techniques: light redirection, humor, a gentle change of subject. None of it worked. Winters stood up. She pointed. She spoke over everyone. The audience fell silent. This was no longer eccentric energy. This was confrontation. And for one of the few times in his career, Carson allowed his irritation to show. He interrupted her, directly, not jokingly, not playfully, firmly. When Winters continued, Carson tried again, then again. Each interruption made the situation clearer to viewers. The host was no longer facilitating a conversation. He was attempting to stop one. Carson had a reputation for absorbing discomfort, so guests didn't have to. Here, he chose not to. His tone hardened. His body language changed. He shuffled his notes. He glanced toward Ed McMahon, a subtle but unmistakable signal that the segment was slipping beyond recovery. Finally, Carson invoked his rarest authority. He called for a commercial break. This was Carson's nuclear option. Commercial breaks were not tools of convenience. They were emergency breaks. When Carson used one to interrupt a guest mid-outburst, the message was unmistakable. The behavior had crossed a line that could not be managed on air. When the show returned, Winters was calmer, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The tension lingered. Carson moved on efficiently, offering no attempt to soften what had just occurred. Behind the scenes, staff later recalled Carson's frustration. He wasn't angry in the explosive sense. He was disappointed. While Winters hadn't merely disrupted the show, she had made it uncomfortable in a way Carson believed violated his responsibility to the audience. Yet even here, Carson's response remained measured. Winters was not permanently banned. She appeared again in later years, though with noticeably more distance and shorter segments. Carson understood her value, but the boundaries had been clarified publicly. The insult wasn't personal. It was procedural. By stopping the show itself, Carson delivered a correction that required no explanation. In a career defined by patience, this moment stands out precisely because he chose order over accommodation. For those watching closely, it was one of the clearest demonstrations of Carson's authority, not asserted through words, but through control of the broadcast itself. Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett was one of the safest bookings Johnny Carson ever made. For years, Hackett's appearances followed a predictable and welcome pattern. He arrived relaxed. Carson gave him space. Hackett told long, winding stories filled with exaggeration, warmth, and carefully timed absurdity. The audience trusted him. Carson trusted him. That trust was the foundation of the segment, which is why this appearance felt so wrong, so quickly. From the moment Hackett began speaking, something felt off. His stories lacked rhythm. The laughter came late, then inconsistently. What should have been playful exaggeration carried an edge that hadn't been there before. As the minutes passed, the edge hardened into bitterness. Hackett stopped telling stories and began airing grievances. He spoke about people in Hollywood who had wronged him. He named types, then names. His tone shifted from comic frustration to something closer to resentment. Carson, recognizing the danger, tried to intervene the way he always did, redirecting with a question, offering a new topic, attempting to steer the conversation back toward humor. Hackett refused. Each attempt at redirection was brushed aside. Hackett continued, growing more pointed, more personal. The audience sensed it immediately. Laughter thinned into scattered murmurs, then silence. This wasn't catharsis disguised as comedy. It was a man using the show to settle scores. That was the moment Carson changed tactics. He contradicted Hackett, openly, not aggressively, not dismissively, but clearly enough to signal that the direction of the conversation was unacceptable. Carson reframed Hackett's remarks, subtly but unmistakably removing their authority. When Hackett persisted, Carson ended the segment early. For a host who prided himself on never cutting guests off, this was extraordinary. The insult wasn't in what Carson said. It was in what he stopped allowing. Carson withdrew the platform. Behind the scenes, staff later recalled Carson's reaction as concern rather than anger. Hackett wasn't reprimanded backstage. He was disgust. Carson worried something was wrong, but concern didn't undo the on-air message. The audience had seen Carson disengage in real time. That disengagement was the insult. It told viewers that Hackett had violated the show's unspoken agreement. Be funny, be entertaining, but never make the audience uncomfortable by dragging them into personal vendettas. Carson believed The Tonight Show was not therapy. It was not confession. It was not a courtroom. Hackett would return in later years, seemingly restored to form. But the incident remained notable precisely because it came from someone Carson trusted. It proved that familiarity did not equal immunity. In a career built on tolerance, Carson drew a quiet line that night, and by stepping back instead of playing along, he delivered one of the most understated rebukes of his tenure. Truman Capote, 1980. Truman Capote's appearance on The Tonight Show in 1980 was not chaotic in the way other disastrous interviews had been. There were no shouting matches, no walk-offs, no overt confrontations. What made it uncomfortable was something far quieter and far more devastating. By this point in his life, Capote was already struggling publicly. His literary achievements were unquestioned, but his personal stability was not. Carson, who admired writers and took genuine interest in intellectual guests, approached the interview with care. He asked measured questions, gave Capote room to speak, and clearly hoped for flashes of the wit that had once made Capote a dazzling conversationalist. What he got instead was fragmentation. Capote slurred his words. His sentences wandered without resolution. He drifted unpredictably between anecdotes, political remarks, and provocative observations that had little connection to one another. The audience laughed occasionally, not out of amusement, but confusion. Carson tried to help. He slowed the pace. He rephrased questions. He gently summarized Capote's statements in an effort to anchor the conversation. When Capote veered into inappropriate territory, Carson redirected him with careful neutrality rather than reprimand. But Capote kept drifting. This was the moment when Carson made a rare and deliberate choice. Instead of rescuing the exchange with humor or covering Capote's incoherence, he allowed the gaps to remain. He corrected Capote gently, reframing his words, clarifying his meaning, and occasionally letting silence settle after particularly disjointed remarks. The effect was brutal. Carson never mocked Capote. He never raised his voice. But by refusing to smooth over the disarray, he allowed the audience to see it clearly. The contrast between Capote's reputation and his performance spoke louder than any insult could have. Behind the scenes, staff recalled Carson's discomfort. He wasn't amused. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. Carson had wanted to showcase Capote's brilliance. Instead, he found himself managing a public unraveling. The insult here was not humiliation. It was exposure. By allowing Capote's words to stand unbuffered, Carson withdrew his protective role. He did not save the guest from himself. In Carson's world, that was a significant departure from instinct. Capote was never invited back. For viewers familiar with Capote's earlier appearances, where his sharp observations and elegant wit had captivated audiences, the contrast was painful. The 1980 interview became a marker, not just of a bad night, but of a broader decline. What makes this moment so revealing is how much restraint it required. Carson could have intervened more aggressively. He could have ended the segment early. Instead, he chose the most surgical response possible. He let the silence do the work. In a career defined by shielding guests from embarrassment, this was one of the few times Johnny Carson stepped aside and allowed reality to speak for itself. Red Foxx, 1975. Red Foxx arrived on The Tonight Show in 1975 as one of television's most recognizable stars. Sanford and Son had made him a household name, and his long career in stand-up comedy gave him confidence that bordered on assumption. Foxx was used to flexibility. He was not used to being told no. The conflict began almost immediately. Foxx was a heavy smoker and had grown accustomed to lighting cigarettes on camera during appearances earlier in his career. What he either didn't know or didn't accept was that network standards had changed. NBC no longer permitted smoking on set. Carson's staff informed Foxx of the rule moments before the interview. Foxx did not take it well. After exchanging brief pleasantries with Johnny Carson, Foxx asked if he could smoke. Carson explained calmly that it wasn't allowed. At first, Foxx seemed to treat the answer as a joke. Carson laughed lightly and attempted to move forward with the interview. Foxx didn't move with him. His demeanor shifted instantly. The humor disappeared. He stated flatly that he could not do the interview without a cigarette. Carson, still assuming this was posturing, tried again to proceed. Foxx stood up instead. Then, without escalation or warning, he walked off the stage. The audience fell silent. For a brief moment, Carson sat alone at his desk, visibly processing what had just happened. This was not a bit. This was not comic timing. This was an outright rejection of the show's authority, delivered live. Carson waited a beat, then responded. His remark was dry, controlled, and unmistakably dismissive. He reframed Foxx's exit as abrupt and childish, offering no sympathy and no attempt to soften the moment. It was one of the rare occasions where Carson allowed himself to comment directly on a guest's behavior after the fact. The insult was brief, but it landed. In Carson's world, walking off was an act of disrespect, not just toward the host, but toward the audience. And Carson believed the audience deserved acknowledgement. By addressing the walk-off plainly and moving on, he reclaimed control of the broadcast in seconds. Behind the scenes, Staff recalled genuine shock. Carson rarely encountered open defiance. He prided himself on making guests comfortable, but he did not negotiate authority. Foxx's departure represented a direct challenge to the structure Carson had spent decades building. Foxx's representatives later attempted to smooth things over, explaining that the comedian had misunderstood the smoking policy and reacted impulsively. Carson accepted the explanation publicly, refusing to inflame the situation further. But the damage was done. Foxx eventually returned to The Tonight Show, but insiders noted a stiffness that hadn't existed before. The ease was gone. The rapport never fully recovered. What makes this incident so significant isn't the argument, it's the speed. One question, one refusal, one exit. And in response, one of the few moments Johnny Carson allowed himself to publicly rebuke a guest. In a career defined by patience and accommodation, this was a rare instance where Carson chose clarity over charm. He didn't chase Foxx. He didn't apologize. He simply reminded viewers and future guests that the desk still belonged to him. What makes these moments endure isn't the chaos. It's the restraint. Johnny Carson built a show on control, patience, and protection. For decades, he absorbed discomfort so audiences wouldn't have to. That's why these 7 moments matter. Each represents a rare decision to stop shielding a guest and enforce the rules of the desk. Not with anger, not with spectacle, but with clarity. In an era that now rewards disruption, Carson's response feels almost radical. He wasn't chasing moments. He was preserving trust and taking it back when necessary.